There's a kind of quiet that isn't peace. You've felt it. The room goes still, and you tell yourself it's nothing, just the house settling, just the wind taking a rest. But some part of you, the old part, the part that kept your great-grandparents alive, sits up straight and goes cold. That's the quiet this story lives in. Before I start, a note. If what you're about to hear is the kind of story you'd want more of, I put 10 of them into an audiobook. It's called The Hollow Files, 5 hours, 10 counties. The same voice you're listening to right now, telling the ones that wouldn't fit in a single night. You'll find the link down in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. Go look when this is over, and while you're settling in, do something for me. Tell me where you're listening from, the town, the country, the hour on your clock. Leave it in the comments. I like knowing where the voice is landing tonight, who's out there in the dark with me. Now then, the story. It begins in the autumn of 1921, in a fold of the Carolina mountains that doesn't carry the same name today that it carried then. The man at the center of it was named Reuben Ashmore, and he was 38 years old, and he did not believe in anything he couldn't put a number to. That was his whole trouble, if you want it plain. Reuben was what they called a timber cruiser. It's an honest old trade, mostly forgotten now. A lumber company would buy the rights to a stretch of mountain, thousands of acres of it, sight unseen, and before they sent in the men and the saws, they'd send in a cruiser to walk every ridge and count what was standing. He'd estimate the board feet in a stand of poplar by eye, mark the lines, draw the maps, and tell the company and the city exactly what their money had bought. He was good at it, the best the Caldwell-Renfro outfit had on their books. He was a tall man, lean the way a fence rail is lean, with a back that had never learned to slump. His hair had gone iron gray early, and he kept it short. He had a long, weathered face, and one eyebrow that sat a little higher than the other, so that he always looked faintly like a man who'd just heard something he didn't quite believe. His hands told you the most about him, big-knuckled, brown as saddle leather, a white scar across the left palm from a survey chain that had whipped loose in cold weather years before, hands that had touched 10,000 trees and never once felt a thing he couldn't explain. He'd been a widower for 6 years by then. I'll come back to that. The company had bought a tract up a watershed the locals called Sorrel's Cove, 12,000 acres of timber that hadn't felt an axe since before the war. And the city men were giddy about it. Virgin poplar, chestnut as wide as a wagon, a fortune standing on the slope, just waiting for someone to draw the lines so the railroad spur could come up the valley to fetch it. So they sent Reuben Ashmore up on the last train of the season, the third week of October, with his chains and his compass and his oilcloth maps, and they told him to be done before the snow. The train let him off at a flag stop called Wadlow's Crossing, which was a coal chute, a water tank, and a store, and not one thing more. From there it was a day's walk up the valley road to the last house, and the last house belonged to a widow named Tenny Selvey. She kept a few rooms for drummers and surveyors and the rare lost soul who came that far up, and she fed them, and she did not say much. She was a square-built woman of about 60, gray-haired, with a face like a closed door and eyes that didn't miss anything. When Reuben told her, over supper that first night, that he'd be working Sorrel's Cove, she set down her fork. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Which part of it?" And Reuben said, "All of it, the whole watershed." He had 12,000 acres to walk before the snow. Mrs. Selvey looked at him a long time. "The lower coves are fine," she said at last. "Good timber, easy ground. You walk the lower coves, and you draw your map, and you tell your company they bought good timber, and that'll be the truth. And the upper end." She got up and started clearing the table. "There's a place where the creek forks," she said with her back to him. "Right one's fine. Left one runs up into a laurel hell, into the high cove under the bald. You don't need to go up there. I have to count what's standing. Then count it from below. Stand at the fork and look up and write down a number. Nobody's going to climb that grade with a saw anyhow. That's not how I do my work, Reuben said. She turned around and looked at him, and there wasn't any heat in it, just a kind of tiredness, the tiredness of a person who has had a conversation many times and watched it end the same way every time. No, she said, I don't expect it is. And she went on clearing the table. Now I want you to picture the valley as he saw it that first week, because the place is half the story. It was beautiful. I want to be fair to it. The poplars were just turning, and the cove was full of gold light in the mornings, and the creek ran clean over gray stones, and there were apples gone wild in an old orchard where somebody's home place had stood a lifetime before. A man could have called it the most peaceful spot in the world and not been lying. But Reuben started noticing things, small things, the kind a man like him would write off. The dogs at the Selvey place wouldn't go up the valley past a certain bend. They'd follow him, glad as anything, tails going, and then at one particular stand of hemlocks they'd stop dead and sit, and watch him walk on without them, and no whistle would move them. He noticed the birds too, or rather, where they weren't. The lower cove was loud with them, but the higher he worked, the quieter it got, until there was a kind of country up there where the only sound was his own boots and the creek, and once far off, a single crow that called twice and then never again. And he noticed the marks. This is the part he couldn't get out of his head, even years later. The old timber up the cove had blazes on it. Now a blaze is just a notch cut in the bark to mark a line or a corner, and a cruiser sees them everywhere, old ones from old surveys grown over and gray. That's nothing. But these weren't survey blazes. They were cut into the big chestnuts at about the height of a man's chest, and they were old, decades old, grown round at the edges so the tree had swallowed half of each one. And they didn't run in a line the way a property mark would. They ran in a ring, a great wide ring, maybe a half-mile across, looping all the way around the head of the left fork, around that high cove under the bald that Mrs. Selvey told him to leave alone. Every big tree on the ring was marked, and the marks all faced the same way. They faced out, away from the cove, like a fence does, like a fence is built to keep something out, or in. He found the old man on the fourth day. He'd stopped to eat at the creek fork, the very place the widow had warned him about, and when he looked up, there was a man standing on the far bank watching him, and Reuben never heard him come. He was old, truly old, the way very few people get. Small and spare and straight-backed, with a face folded by more weather than one life ought to hold, and long white hair tied back, and dark eyes that were perfectly steady. He wore a wool coat that had been good once, and a hat gone shapeless with age, and he had a walking staff cut from some pale wood. The valley people called him Ammons, Reuben would learn, though that wasn't the name his own people had given him. He was Cherokee, one of the families that had never left, that had hidden in the high coves and the laurel, back in the terrible winter of 1838, when the soldiers came through to drive everybody west, and a stubborn handful slipped up into country the soldiers wouldn't climb and stayed and outlasted them. His people had been in those mountains longer than any deed in any courthouse, longer than the courthouses, longer than the language they wrote the deeds in. So when an old man like that looks across a creek at you and tells you to come away from a certain place, a wise man listens. Reuben Ashmore, I have told you, was not at that time a wise man. You're the one counting trees, the old man said. His English was slow and exact, each word set down like a stone. Reuben allowed that he was. The old man looked up the left fork, into the laurel and the dark of the high cove for a while. Then he said, "You see the marks." It wasn't a question, so Reuben didn't answer it. "My grandfather's grandfather cut some of those," the old man said, "and men before him cut the older ones. We kept them up. Every few years somebody went round and cut them fresh, so the trees wouldn't take them all the way. That was a job that got handed down." "Whose job is it now?" Reuben asked. The old man almost smiled. There was no happiness in it. "Nobody's," he said. "There's not enough of us left who will climb up here to do it. The young ones don't believe it, the way you don't believe it. So the trees are taking the marks back." He looked at Reuben then very directly. "And the ring's going to open," he said. "It's mostly open already. You can feel it if you stand still long enough. That's why your dogs won't come." "They're not my dogs," Reuben said, because he didn't know what else to say. "No," the old man agreed. "They're smarter than you, is all I meant." Now I'll tell you what the old man told Reuben, but I want to be careful and honest about it. He did not give Reuben a creature with a name. He did not recite some legend off a page. He told Reuben only what he himself had seen and what the old people had always done. And he was plain about the difference between the two. I'll keep that line where he kept it, because it's not my place or anybody's to put words in the mouths of his people about a thing they chose to keep to themselves for 200 years. What he said was this: there was something in the high cove. There always had been. The old people didn't go up there, and they didn't avoid it the way you avoid a steep grade or a snake den. They avoided it the way you'd avoid a sickness you couldn't catch twice, because you'd watched it take somebody. It wasn't an animal. An animal you could understand. It didn't hunt the way a bear or a cat hunts. It waited. And the way it took people, when it took them, was the cruelest thing the old man had ever known. And the reason his people had ringed the cove instead of trying to fight it. It learned voices. That was the whole horror of it, the way he told it. It listened, from up in the laurel, to the people who passed below. It learned the sound of them, and then, at dusk, when the light went out of the cove and a man's eyes started lying to him, it would call. It would call in the voice of someone you loved, someone who was gone more often than not. It seemed to know which voice would pull hardest, and it would call from a little farther up the slope than you were, and a little farther, and a little farther. And every step you took toward that voice was a step deeper into the cove, until you couldn't find your way back out, and the dark came down. And what happened to the men who followed the voice all the way in, the old man would not say, except this. He said sometimes they found the man's gear, his coat, his boots, set neat side by side, as if he'd taken them off himself to walk on. Once a hat hung careful on a laurel branch, well past where any man would have walked in his right mind. And he said once a man came back. A man came back out of that cove after 3 days, and he was alive, and he had no marks on him. But he never spoke right again. He'd open his mouth to talk, and out would come a voice that wasn't his, a voice belonging to people long dead, people he'd never met, in an old tongue and in English both, all of it jumbled. And he'd flinch at every dusk for the rest of his days, and he died old and silent in a cabin his family kept for him, far down the valley, where the light stayed long in the evening. That's why we marked the trees facing out, the old man said, so a person coming up the mountain would see the ring and know, this far, no farther. The marks were a kindness. They were the most we could do. Then he looked at the sun, which was already leaning west. "Go back down to the widows," he said. "Count your lower trees. Tell your company a number for the high cove. They'll never climb up here, and the saws will never come, and everyone will be better for the lie." And he turned and went up the right fork, the safe one, with that long, easy stride old mountain people keep to the end, and Reuben watched him out of sight and then sat by the creek a good while. I'll be honest with you about what Reuben felt. He felt the cold thing every one of us feels at a story like that, the old animal part, sitting up straight. And then the daylight part of him, the part that lived on numbers, took over and explained it all away. A frightened old man, a superstition kept up by an old family for old reasons, the kind of thing that grows in isolated country like moss on the north side of a stone. The marks were probably an ancient boundary, a line between two families' hunting grounds, that's all, and the rest was a tale told to keep children away from a dangerous grade. The voices, the disappearances, the man who came back wrong. People go missing in steep country all the time. They fall. They get lost. They freeze. And the mind fills in the rest with ghosts because ghosts are easier to live next to than a senseless slip on wet leaves. That was Reuben Ashmore's whole faith, right there, that there was always an explanation, that the universe kept its books in numbers, and the numbers always balanced. And a man who was careful and brave enough to do the arithmetic had nothing to fear from the dark. Let me stop here a moment because I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it down in the comments. Have you ever had it, that feeling? That cold, certain feeling that you should not go somewhere, or open some door, or take some road with no reason you could write down? And did you listen to it, or did you talk yourself out of it the way Reuben did? Tell me. I read these. The premonition that turned out right, or the one you ignored. Put it in the comments. I'll be reading them tonight, while the rest of you sleep. And listen, before we go up into that cove with him. A breath here, before what comes next. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection. It's called The Hollow Files. 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about right now from 10 different counties, where the maps run out. The link is in the description below, and it's pinned at the top of the comments. Go pour another cup of coffee, and we'll go back to the story. Now, the story. Reuben worked the lower cove for 2 more weeks, and it was, as everyone had promised him, good timber and easy ground, and he counted it and marked it and drew it clean. And every evening he came back to the widow's, and every evening the ring of marked trees up at the head of the left fork sat in his mind like a coin under a mattress, the lump you can't stop feeling no matter how you turn. Because here was the thing that ate at him, the professional thing, the thing he couldn't let go of. He hadn't counted the high cove. He'd guessed it. He'd stood at the fork and looked up and put down a number, the way the widow said, the way the old man said. And the number was a lie. It might have been low by half. There might be the finest stand of old poplar in the whole tract up in that bowl under the bald, and he had no way to know because he hadn't walked it. And Reuben Ashmore had never in his life turned in a map with a lie on it. He told himself it was about the work, his pride in the work, that a man who'd guess one corner would guess them all, and then what was he worth? But I think, looking at it from here, it was about the other thing, too. It was about a stubborn man being told there was a door he wasn't allowed to open. It was about 6 years of being a careful, reasonable, lonely man, and some part of him, the part he never looked at straight, wanting to walk up into a place where the old man swore. You could hear a voice you'd lost. You can guess whose voice Reuben had lost. Her name was Cordelia. She'd been gone 6 years, and he had not let himself think her name out loud in about that long, because he was a man who balanced his books, and grief is the one debt that never balances no matter how you work it. So, on the last good day before the weather turned, the second week of November, with the sky the flat white of coming snow and the light already thin, Reuben Ashmore packed his chains and his compass and a lantern, and against every warning he'd been given, he started up the left fork. He told himself he'd be down by full dark. He told himself a great many things. The widow watched him go from her porch and didn't say a word, because she'd said them all. The grade was bad, like they told him. The laurel was worse, that low, twisted evergreen the mountain people call a laurel hell, because that's exactly what it is to walk through, a maze with a roof, where you can't see 10 feet, and the branches grab you and turn you around so gentle you don't notice you're going wrong. But Reuben was a cruiser. Getting through bad ground was the whole craft. He kept his compass in his hand and his bearing in his head, and he pushed up through it, ducking and twisting, his breath loud in that closed green dark, and after a long, hard while he came out of the laurel and into the high cove itself. And I'll tell you, it was worth seeing. It was a great green bowl tucked under the bald, ringed by the marked trees, and the timber in it was the finest he'd ever stood under. Poplars, straight as church columns, going up and up, chestnuts wider than a kitchen table, old, old trees that had never heard a saw, in a stillness so complete he could hear the blood in his own ears, and it was cold, far colder than the climb should have left him. The kind of cold that doesn't come off snow, that comes up out of the ground, that settles on the back of your neck and stays. He went to work. He ran his lines and counted his trees, and the cruiser in him fell silent and happy, because the timber was even better than he'd hoped, and the lie he'd told the company turned out to be a lie that cost them a fortune, and he was going to fix it. He lost track of time. That was the first thing. A careful man, a man with a compass in his hand, and he looked up, and the light in the cove had gone the deep blue-gray of dusk, and he could not for the life of him have told you how. It had been white midday a little while ago. It seemed like a little while ago. But the day was nearly gone, and a cruiser knows in his bones how long a day's work takes, and this wasn't possible. And he stood there in the cold with his chain in his hand, and felt for the first time since boyhood the old animal part of him stand all the way up. The cove had gone silent in a new way, not the empty silence of high country, a held silence, a waiting silence, the exact silence I told you about at the very start of this, the kind that isn't peace. Reuben packed up fast. He got his bearings south by the compass, toward the Laurel and the way down, and he stepped off toward home, and he kept his eyes on the needle and his mind on the numbers, and told himself he'd be laughing about this by the time he reached the widow's table. And that was when she called his name. I want to slow down here, because I want you to understand it wasn't a trick a frightened man plays on himself in the dark. He'd have given anything for it to have been that. He spent the rest of his life trying to make it have been that. It was her voice, Cordelia's voice, not a voice like hers. Hers, the exact pitch of it, and the exact way she'd lift the end of his name like a question, even when it wasn't one, the way that had annoyed him in life, and that he'd have walked into fire to hear again. Reuben, from up the slope behind him, a little above, a little to the left. He stopped. The whole world stopped. He stood there in the blue dark with his compass in his hand, pointing him south toward safety, and he did not move south, because every cell in his body had turned around to face the voice, and the daylight part of him, the careful part, the part that balanced books, that part of him was screaming the truth. That's not her. She's 6 years gone. That's the thing. That's the cove. Walk south right now, and do not turn your head. And the other part of him, the buried part, the lonely part, said only one word. What if? What if it's her? What if there's something in this world your numbers never accounted for? What if she's right there, just up the slope, just past those trees, and all you have to do is go? Reuben. Softer now, closer, and a sound under it that broke him clean in half. The small sound she used to make, that little catch of breath, that nobody else in the whole world had ever heard but him, because it only happened in the dark of their own room. It knew that sound. There was no possible way on this earth that it could know that sound. He turned around. He took a step up the slope. He'll tell you, the few times he ever told it, that he doesn't remember deciding to, that his foot just went, the way your foot goes when you miss a stair, before any part of you that thinks has a say. One step. Then he stood there with his lantern in one hand and his compass in the other, both forgotten. And the voice ahead of him in the dark said his name again. Glad, so glad. Like she'd been waiting 6 years right there in that cove for him to finally come up and find her. And he took another step and another, up away from south, up away from the marked trees, up into the deep of it, and the cold closed over him like water. I don't know how far up he got. He didn't know either. That's the truth of it. There's a piece of that climb he never got back. He remembered the voice, always ahead, always a little higher, and the laurel closing in again though the way down had been clear, and a smell on the cold air like turned earth, and old leaves, and something underneath that he could never name and never forgot. And he remembered that, At some point his lantern had gone out, and he hadn't noticed it go out. And he was climbing in full dark toward a voice, with his hands out in front of him, and he had stopped being afraid. That was the worst part, when he'd tell it. The voice in his own head, the careful one, had gone quiet. He wasn't fighting anymore. He was just going peaceful toward her, deeper and deeper. And some far-off part of him understood with no fear at all that he was not going to come back down this mountain. And that was all right, because she was just ahead. And then a hand closed on his arm, a real hand, hard and small and strong as a root. And the old man's voice, right at his ear, low and furious and absolutely calm all at once, said, "Don't answer it, whatever it says next. Don't answer it. Don't say her name. The second you say her name back, it's got you." Reuben came back into himself the way you come up out of deep water, all at once, lungs burning, the dark roaring. The voice ahead of him called again, and oh, it was sweet. It was pleading now. It was saying, "Come on, why'd you stop? I'm right here." And it knew it was losing him, and the love in it turned to something underneath that was not love at all, something old and patient and starving. And for 1/2 a second, the whole shape of the thing showed through the voice, the way a face shows through a sheet. And Reuben Ashmore did the hardest thing he ever did in his life. He shut his mouth. He did not say her name. The old man turned him by the arm, bodily the way you'd turn a sleepwalking man, and put the compass back in his hand, and closed his fingers over it, and put his mouth right against Reuben's ear, and said one word, "South." And he went down the mountain with him in the dark, the old man's hand never once leaving his arm, the two of them crashing through the laurel hell, while behind and above them the voice followed. It followed them down. It called the whole way. It tried her voice. When that stopped working, it tried others. Voices Reuben didn't know, an old woman, a child laughing that turned his blood to ice, though I'll spare you that part. A man calling for help that sounded so real, Reuben nearly stopped twice, and twice the old man's hand wrenched him forward. And once, near the bottom, when they were almost to the ring of marked trees, it called in the old man's own voice. It called the old man by his true name, the name his people had given him, from just behind his shoulder. And the old man, 80-some years old, who had lived his whole life in those mountains and buried everyone he'd ever loved, the old man flinched like he'd been struck, and his hand shook on Reuben's arm, but he didn't turn around either. They crossed the line of marked trees, that wide old ring with the blazes facing out, and the instant they were past it, on the downhill side, the voice cut off. Not faded, cut, like a door shut on it. The silence after was just silence, the ordinary kind, wind in the high limbs and the creek somewhere below, and the two of them standing there in the dark, breathing like they'd run from something, which they had. The old man let go of Reuben's arm. For a while neither of them said anything. Then the old man said, very quietly and very tired, "It hasn't called my name in 40 years. It must be hungrier than I knew." And he looked back up the dark slope toward the cove. "The ring's almost gone. Somebody'll have to cut the marks fresh, and there's nobody left to do it, and the company's going to send up men with saws." He turned and looked at Reuben in the dark. "You're going to draw your map," he said. "And on the map, the high cove is going to be poor timber, scrub, burned over ground, not worth the railroad. You understand me? You're going to lie the way I told you to lie at the start, and this time you're going to mean it, because you've heard her now, and you know what it is you'd be sending those men up to hear." Reuben Ashmore, who had never in his life turned in a map with a lie on it, said yes. He said yes without 1 second's hesitation, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. He got down to the widow's sometime deep in the night. She was up. She'd left a lamp in the window and the door unbarred, and when he came in white-faced and shaking, she didn't ask him a single question. She just put coffee in front of him and sat across the table while he drank it and couldn't hold the cup steady, and after a long while she said, "He brought you out then, And Reuben said, "Yes." "He's the last one who'll do that," she said. "He brought my husband's brother out 30 years back. Wasn't able to bring my husband." She looked at the lamp. "After him, there's nobody who knows the way in the dark. So you do what he told you. You make sure those saws never come up this valley. You hear?" He heard. "Now let me tell you how it ends, because it doesn't end the way you'd want, and I won't pretend it does." Reuben Ashmore drew his map, and on it, the head of the left fork, the high cove under the bald 1,200 of the finest virgin acres in the southern mountains, was marked Poor Scrub. Fire-scarred, inaccessible grade, not worth the spur line. He wrote a number so low the company in the city cursed his name and cut the upper cove out of the project entirely. The saws came up the right fork the next spring and took the lower timber and never went near the left, and the railroad reached the creek fork and stopped, and a man could stand at the end of the rails and look up the left fork into the Laurel, and the company never spent $1 on it. All because of one cruiser's honest reputation and one dishonest map. He saved their lives, whoever they'd have been, the men they'd have sent. He'll never know their names. That's the kind of thing a man doesn't get thanked for, because the people he saved never know they needed saving. He carried that alone. The old man died the following winter. Reuben heard about it months after. He'd gone up to cut the marks fresh one last time. The family said, all alone, an old man climbing up into the Laurel in the cold to keep up a job that had been handed down for 200 years, and he'd come back down and taken to his bed and not got up again. They said at the end, he talked in his sleep, in voices that weren't his. They didn't think much of it. Old men do that. Reuben Ashmore quit the timber business that year. He never said why to anyone but his own self. He moved down out of the mountains to flat, open country where the light stayed long in the evening, the way that man from the old story had, the one who came back wrong. He lived a good while. He was a quiet man and a decent one, and he never married again. And as far as anyone knew, he made his peace with the world. But here's the part I'll leave you with. For the rest of his life, Reuben Ashmore could not stand to be out at dusk. That gray hour when the light goes out of the day and a man's eyes start to lie to him, he was indoors by then, every evening, lamps lit, with someone near if he could manage it. Because every now and again at that hour, in the quiet, he'd hear it, just for a second. From the next room, or the top of the stairs, or just outside the window where the dark was coming down, her voice, lifting the end of his name like a question. "Reuben?" "Tom." And he'd sit very still, an old man now, his big scarred hands flat on the table, and he would not turn his head, and he would not answer. Because he'd learned, up in that cove, the one number his whole careful life never taught him, that the worst things don't roar. They wait, and they learned the one voice that you, and only you, can't say no to. And the day you answer back is the day they've got you, so he never answered. As far as I know, he never did. But I'll tell you what I can't stop wondering, and I'll let you wonder it with me. It followed them down the mountain. It called all the way to the ring of trees, and then the ring shut it out. But the ring's gone now. The old man was the last to keep it. The trees took the marks back years ago. So I sit here some evenings at that gray hour, and I think about a thing that learned how to follow a voice it wanted, down a whole mountain, in the dark. And I think about how there's nobody left to shut the door, and you listening to me right now, wherever you are, whatever the hour is on your clock. Has the quiet in your house changed in the last little while? Has it gone from the empty kind to the waiting kind? If you ever hear your name from a room you know is empty, in a voice you lost, soft, lifting at the end like a question, don't answer it. Whatever it says next, don't answer it. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe there are places that were left alone on purpose by people who knew better than we do? Or is it all frightened old men and wet leaves and a mind filling in the dark? Tell me down in the comments. I read every one. And if you know a story like this one, a real one The kind that runs in your own family and never made it into any book, tell me that too. It might be the next thing I sit down and tell in the dark. If this one kept you company tonight, the audiobook has 10 more waiting. The Hollow Files. Links in the description, pinned at the top of the comments. This has been Macabre Forgotten Tales. Stay with me for the next one, and keep a light on.